Okay, so I'm just going to talk briefly to give us some time for discussion at the end about some work that we're doing in India on understanding preferences for improved cook stoves and trying to stimulate adoption of these stoves. So these are technologies that would reduce some of those inefficiencies associated with traditional stoves and burn fuel in a cleaner way, save fuel potentially, in theory, lead to health benefits as well. When we started this work a couple of years ago, there had been very few studies of adoption of improved cook stoves. And Subrendu and one of his graduate students actually did a systematic literature review looking for papers in the literature that talked about improved cook stove adoption. They found about 12 studies, something like that, for a problem that affects billions of people. And those studies were variable in quality. So if you look here, this is kind of a vote counting exercise of things that seem to make a difference in terms of whether people adopt improved cook stoves or not. And for a lot of these kind of factors on the left-hand side, there are just a couple of studies that deal with them. So a lot of uncertainty in this space, not a lot of knowledge. There have been a couple of recent randomized controlled trials that have gotten some attention in the press that have contributed since this systematic review came out. But they're in very specific contexts, and their results are not always entirely consistent. So one of the things that we've been kind of interested in is whether we could contribute to this body of evidence by doing some rigorous studies in India across a couple of different settings to understand the importance of context as well as user preferences and behaviors, which vary according to context. In preparation for this work, I worked with Subrendu to do some simulations of net benefits from switching stoves. So these are cumulative probability distributions that show the social net benefits that would be derived from a switch from something like a traditional stove to a variety of different cleaner burning stoves of different types. And some of these stoves are cleaner than others, but the net benefits are not always unambiguously positive. They depend on a lot of things, and what's kind of behind these simulations is, again, literature reviews collecting parameters on the various costs and benefits of these stoves, seeing whether changing those assumptions about technical efficiency of a stove, how often a household uses that stove, what the value of those reductions actually are, what that means for costs and benefits. So, if you look at these, it's not necessarily always a winning solution from a societal perspective, and the private perspective looks pretty similar actually as well. Private benefits don't include the things like the global climate benefits and some of the environmental benefits, but they include private benefits like health benefits and time savings. So the work that we've been doing in India is focused on two different field sites. One is located in the plains of the Ganges in Uttar Pradesh, very densely populated place where almost everybody is using traditional biomass stoves. And the second site is in the mountains in Uttarakhand, where the climate is different, access to fuel and firewood is quite different. But again, households tend to use traditional stoves a lot. And if they have improved stoves, they're often using them in combination with traditional stoves. So what we've found in some initial field surveys is a variety of things about household preferences. And we haven't yet done the experiments where we're trying to see systematically who adopts and under what conditions they adopt, how we can stimulate that adoption. But we've asked people to play games looking at a variety of different stove options that have different features. So some of them save more fuel than others. Some emit less smoke than others. And all of these different options that people can choose from have prices associated with them. So we have households play these games, select their preferred stove in a series of repeated choice tasks, and then we try to tease out what that tells us about their preferences for these different improved features. What we found through those games is that there are very strong preferences for traditional stoves, even when those traditional stoves are emitting a lot of smoke and using a lot of fuel. And part of that is not wanting to pay for an improved stove, because these traditional stoves are essentially free of charge in terms of people just build them in their homes with locally available materials. They don't actually pay for those. But also some of it is that there are actually some benefits to inefficient stoves. And in a place like Uttarakhand in the mountains, where it's cold for long parts of the year, the stove is a key component of their heating, their in-house heating during cold periods. And then the other side of that is that traditional stoves are a known quantity. People know how to cook on these devices. Give people an improved stove, they don't necessarily know immediately how to use that and how to use it to cook the things that they like to eat. The other thing that we found is that higher socioeconomic status is not surprisingly correlated with willingness to pay for these improved stoves. These people have more income available. They know more about the benefits of the stoves. And they often have experience with non-traditional stoves in the form of LPG stoves or other kinds of alternative technologies. The value of these traditional stoves obviously depends a lot on the context, the weather, the climate, et cetera, also access to fuel. And the value of reduced smoke seems to be something that speaks to people more than the fuel savings that people would get. But I say that with kind of one caveat in mind, in particular, that most of our sample was women, and so they may be more sensitive to the smoke impacts. But still, we seem to see this across kind of different segments of the sample. And then finally, we looked a little bit at risk preferences and sort of time preferences and how those correlate with preferences. It seems like both risk-taking and patient households tend to be less price responsive on the one hand, but it's also true that risk-taking kinds of households seem to be less bothered about smoke reductions. So they're less worried about smoke. Just one more slide. We've kind of looked across this entire sample for patterns in the way people make choices in these games. And we do a latent class analysis that kind of looks at how these patterns sort of line up within our sample to identify 4 different types of households. And in these 4 types of households, the vast majority of them fall in this group that's very responsive to price and sort of thinks about traditional stoves and really doesn't care much about the benefits of improved stoves, number of cooking surfaces, things like reduced smoke, and things like reduced fuel requirements. Then there are sort of these other groups of households, which are the other half of the sample, and some of them are highly sensitive to price. So these are these people who might be people that you could target with subsidies to try to get them to adopt more stoves. But then there are also, some that, tend to like traditional stoves a lot and could be thought of as maybe using multiple stoves because they're unlikely to abandon their traditional stove. Or people who sort of look like a likely adopting group. This is about 15% of the sample. So bottom line is that demand doesn't seem to be very high in this sample, and that there need to be some interventions to stimulate demand if that's going to be sort of a strategy for disseminating and reaching a lot of people. And I'll stop there.